Okay, one of the questions, my name is Andy, I'm from Atlanta, Georgia. Lived there most of my life, originally from North Carolina. No, okay. Anyway, real quick question, and for those of you who are watching in remote sites, I'd love for you to participate as well. How many of you, this is your first LeaderCast event? I'm just curious. Oh yeah, a lot of new folks who don't know what to, I could have repeated last year's content if I'd done that. Anyway, it's good to see all of you, and for those of you who have joined remotely, thank you as well. I absolutely love this topic. In fact, I love the theme. I love the theme so much that I'm going to have a hard time sticking with my notes, but I'm going to make myself do that because I want to honor my time. But this is the whole idea of shift is so extraordinarily important because, as we're going to see in just a few minutes when I jump into my actual content, we have experienced something that previous generations did not experience, in that we were forced personally, family, business, nonprofit, for-profit, marketplace, we were all forced into a shift. We had to shift or we died. We had to shift or we didn't survive. And the natural reaction to coming through something very, very difficult is always at the end of it to relax and to try to go back to what we knew before and to go back to doing the way, things the way they've always been done before. And even though you know that you shouldn't do that because you're a leader, that's just the natural tendency, that's the natural response. So when LeaderCast invited me again, and I'm so grateful to Joe for inviting me back, when they told me what the topic was, I thought this is the perfect topic because now more than ever, we cannot forget what we've learned, and we can't go back to what we've always done. And we have, as business leaders, especially and nonprofit leaders, we have to figure out how to create a culture that not only takes forward what we've learned, we've got to create a culture that is so nimble that the whole idea of shifting becomes second nature, because as we've already discovered in the last few weeks, in the last few months, this is not over. And great leaders understand that tragedy is an opportunity, that negative things are an opportunity, that unforeseeable interruption in what we're doing is there's always opportunities to be had there. But the only individuals, the only leaders who take advantage of that are the ones who have created a culture, either personally or within their organization, that thrives on change and thrives on the shift. So that's what I want to talk about for just a few minutes. And I want to go ahead and start with actually some terminology that LeaderCast created when they created this event. And so this is right out of the LeaderCast playbook. This isn't original with me, but I loved it so much, I just thought it'd be a great place to start, and we'll throw this up here. Leaders must make major shifts in order to move forward to achieve their purpose. Changing direction is hard, right? Risky and expensive, they could have added, but it's the only way to get to where we need to go. The future will be created by fearless, innovative leaders who have the courage to shift. And we've seen that historically, we've seen that personally, we've watched in culture in general as some extraordinary organizations have made that shift and others have not. I love this quote by Alvin Toffler. He kind of dovetails into what we just read. The illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read or write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. And because, as some of you know, I'm a pastor professionally, I couldn't help but add a C.S. Lewis quote, but this is so relevant to what we're talking about. Here's what C.S. Lewis wrote a long time ago. We all want progress. In fact, what makes you a leader is the fact that you're just so dissatisfied with the status quo. I'm surrounded by young leaders like a lot of you are. They're never happy or satisfied with anything, and it bugs me and it motivates me. And I try to allow it to motivate me more than it bugs me, because once upon a time I was that 25-year-old kid that just drove everybody around me crazy because I just we just weren't moving fast enough. We all want progress, but if you're on the wrong road, progress means doing an about turn and walking back to the right road. In that case, the man or woman who turns back the soonest is the one who is most progressive. Now, we've all lived long enough, and we've all been in business, in the marketplace, nonprofit long enough to know what happens to organizations, especially large organizations that get a lot of attention, what happens when they don't shift. I mean, we all know the Blockbuster story. We know the BlackBerry story. In recent years, we've watched what's happened to music distribution and film distribution and even film making when companies weren't willing to make those shifts. Because to refuse to shift when the market or culture requires it, what happens is we end up getting in our own way. That when we look back on our own story, or people look back on the organizations that we work for, or even the industry that we're in, they look back and the story goes like this. It wasn't the economy, it wasn't the marketplace, it was the people in the organization that weren't willing to change quick enough, or weren't nimble enough to make the change, or weren't willing to make a shift when everything in culture said you've got to shift. They weren't willing to spend the money, or as we're going to talk about for a few minutes, they were so in love, and this is something we all have to guard against. They were so in love with the way they did things, they weren't willing to quit doing things the way they had learned to do them and became known for doing them. Now, in my industry, because I'm a pastor, the church probably struggles as much or more than any industry, if you can think of the church as an industry, with change or shifting. And I think part of the problem is, and this isn't a dig because I live what I do, but our product is 2,000 years old. Okay, think about that. When you start messing with a 2,000-year-old product that's an international product that has been sort of viewed the same way for 2,000 years, when you start talking about change or shifting, everybody gets really, really, really nervous. And yet in church world, the tension is reflected in the business world and not-profit world in this way. That if we're not careful, we become so comfortable with how we do what we do that we lose sight of why we're doing it and, most importantly, who we're doing it for. And in every business, in every industry, the gravitational pull is to become enamored with how we do what we do, not why we do it or who we are doing it for. And when an organization, profit or nonprofit, marketplace or, again, private or publicly held, privately held, when the leaders in an organization fall in love with the how and lose sight of the what and the who, or the why and the who, there is an automatic, invisible, intangible resistance to shifting. So in the few minutes I have with you today, at the end, I'm going to give you 3 questions that just rattle around in my head. In fact, 2 of these sit on my credenza and have for years to help me not fall into this trap. Because even though I'm up here talking about it, I am, in fact, because our organization is 26 years old, I am as susceptible to this, and I am more set up for this than ever before. I wrote in my notes that we're all just one refusal to shift away from irrelevance, insolvency, or a hole we'll never dig ourselves out of. And again, 2020 highlighted all this because the pandemic was an accelerant. What we experienced is sudden change that we really had no control over, and many of the changes were good, but what happened is, and you're smart, you know this, things that were slowly moving in a direction anyway, suddenly it all got speeded up, and then they hit the brakes, and suddenly we're almost into the future without even realizing it. Scott Galloway, I don't know if you've read his book, Post-Corona. I highly recommend it. Here's what he says about this. I love this quote. The whole book is fascinating. He says, "We registered a decade of e-commerce growth in 8 weeks." You got to read the book for the context, but here's his point. That in a specific 8-week period in the summer, specifically the summer of 2020, that in terms of e-commerce, there was a decade of growth which required a decade of change, and the changes were underway anyway, but suddenly it all got fast forwarded. Take any trend with whether it's social, business, or personal. And fast forward, he says, 10 years. And that's what happened in 8 weeks. Now, the point is this. During 2020, a lot of us, either personally, corporately, marketplace, whatever you do, your industry, were forced to make quick changes, and there was virtually no resistance, because it was shift or die, right? It was shift or be left behind. It was shift or you become almost overnight irrelevant. So the goal for us, I mean, again, in my world, the churches that immediately were able to shift to online services and online communication, we did fine. The churches that weren't able to make the shift or didn't have the infrastructure to make it, they suffered. The churches that automatically went to online giving or had already moved to online giving because that was a future trend, they did pretty good during 2020. The churches that didn't had a difficult time. The restaurants that immediately went to takeout, that immediately went to drive up and curbside service, that immediately went to QR codes. I mean, all those trends were already in the works. Things were already moving in that direction, but because of the COVID and because of 2020, suddenly all of that gets speeded up. But when there's an emergency, you just shift. When there's an emergency in your family, you forget the schedule and you focus on that child. You focus on your marriage. You focus on, getting out of debt, whatever it might be. So the lesson, and the reason this is such an important topic and why today is so important for those of us in leadership, we have experienced being forced through, the tempest of an environment and a disease that caused us to shift. The question is this: are we willing, now that we've seen the benefits and what happens if we don't, are we willing to now go back to work and create cultures, organizational cultures, that are not shift adverse, but understand now that shifting is actually a growth engine. Shifting is actually a growth engine. I think for the rest of my life, when I sit down at a restaurant, there's going to be a QR code in the middle of the table. I'm glad. I don't want to pick up a menu anyway, right? I think many of these changes, they're permanent. So the challenge for us, and the reason I love talking about this, the challenge for us is, can we make personal shifts, corporate shifts, maybe industry-wide shifts, depending on where you sit and what you do, that positions you not only for what's happening now, but sets you up for the pace of change that will continue to accelerate. It is not going backwards. The problem is, or the challenge, and I deal with this constantly in my own heart, my own organization, is that success builds a natural resistance to any major shift. That success builds a natural resistance to any major shift or any major change. There's organizational muscle memory, there's ingrained cultures. Success just makes us risk adverse, or the way I say it to our staff all the time, remember this, I say, organizations do what they're organized to do, whether it's what needs to be done or not. Organizations, if you're a manager, a leader, or you run a franchise, you know the frustration of standing up in front of your staff and casting a very compelling vision. Here's where we're going, here's how we're going to get there. And everybody's cheering, and then you got swag and a shirt and a bag, and everybody's excited. And then when that rah-rah cheerleading session's over, everybody goes back to work. And they do what you hired them to do, because organizations do what organizations are designed and created and organized to do, whether it's what needs to be done or not. So for the leader who gets this, and for the leader who embraces the content that you're going to hear today, and for the leader, as I'm saying this, you're thinking, I already knew this. For the leader who decides, I'm going to go home, figure out how to infuse this into our organization, for the leader who gets this right, you'll go home and not just make a speech. You have to go home and make organizational, technical, day-to-day change. Because at the end of the day, regardless of what you believe and what you do, your organization is like my organization. It's going to do what it's organized to do, whether that's what needs to be done or not. And this is why this event's called LeaderCast. Because you don't generally manage organizations to change. In fact, you manage organizations to sameness. This is the constant tension. We won't get into this day. That constant tension between leadership and management. You got to have both. The leaders are messing things up. The managers are fixing it. The leaders like, let's change it. The managers like, hey, we need systems, so there's predictability. And you need predictability and you need change. But as the leader, we're the ones that have to create the momentum internally to drag our organizations forward. Otherwise, we miss the extraordinary opportunity that culture is constantly providing us because of things we have basically no control over. One of my favorite quotes, I think it's because I read it. It's my first leadership book I ever read back in, I think, the late 80s, the Leadership Challenge. And this quote I framed it, it sits on my credenza, it has for many, many years. It says this: leaders, that's us, that's why we're doing this, must challenge the process precisely because any system will unconsciously, your organization is unconscious. I mean, you can't even show me your organization, but there's a dynamic, right, that controls behaviors. Systems control behaviors. Systems control behaviors. The leaders must challenge the process precisely because any system will unconsciously conspire to maintain the status quo and prevent change. So this isn't easy because everything in our organizations and everything in our systems is conspiring against us. And this is why we need leaders. And this is why your organization needs you. And that's why today, a day like today, is so important, because every organization or every industry has a prevailing model. Every industry has shared assumptions, which means every industry is stuck, not broken, stuck. And here's the thing that should scare us out of our apathy. Somebody somewhere is challenging the assumptions in your industry, and they're messing with the rules that have always been the rules in your industry, whether it's profit, nonprofit, church, banking, construction, whatever it is. And they're messing with the rules to the prevailing model. And your goal and my goal is to recognize that and embrace it and not resist it. And that has a lot to do with leadership and the cultures that we create. So that means we can't fall in love with an idea or a product, a model or an approach. We have to stay focused on the problem our ideas and our products and our models and approaches were designed to solve. And if we do that, we will see the pressure to shift as an opportunity instead of something to push back against. So what I want to do for the next few minutes is Shane, who's running my slides for me, I want to skip this next illustration because I want to spend some more time on these three questions in a minute. So let's just jump past all that, if that's okay. So here's what happens, and then I'm going to give you these three questions. Our time and our focus, and as a leader, I live in this world every day, so I'm not up here as the expert who's figured this out. Our time and our focus and our energy and even our hiring, it drifts towards, and I understand this, it drifts towards creating better margins with our current solution. Because I'm all for margins and you're all for margins, right? But unfortunately, because of organizational life and because we tend to manage things to sameness, over time our focus and our energy and our hiring drift toward creating better margins with our current solution rather than exploring new and better solutions. So our obsession drifts from solving problems to generating revenue, which makes perfect sense. The problem is when the shift comes along, or when the opportunity or the need for a shift comes along, it doesn't fit that model and it doesn't fit well within that context, because a shift is change, and change is expensive, and change is risky, and you don't know if it's going to work. If you knew it was going to work, you would have already done it. So everything about organizational life conspires against what we're talking about today. And yet we have just experienced in 2020 and even beyond how extraordinarily important it is. And we've also experienced that we can do it if we need to. The question is, will we do it when we don't need to? Will we do it because we know it's the thing to do? Because somebody out there is devoting 100% of their time and their resources to a new and better solution. Now, if you've ever been a part of a startup, you totally get this. Because in a startup, for the most part, a startup is like 100% shift, right? It's just 100% shift. I mean, Tesla, of course, is the best example. How many gas engines and gas, carburetor-driven, cars did Tesla make? Well, of course, none. They didn't transition. They didn't shift from a traditional vehicle to electric. It was just all shift. And do you remember the first thing? Remember what you used to think about electric vehicles? Maybe I'm just saying too much, but I just thought they're so cute. But who's going to do that? I mean, I'm a truck guy. This is what I thought. I have a Ford F-150. I'm a truck guy. I thought, well, that's cute for all the people who aren't truck people, but they're not going to make an electric truck. And of course they have. So a startup is 100% shift, and a successful startup is 100% a threat to any organization or industry that doesn't understand how to blend this into the culture of the organization. And I think one of the reasons I'm so passionate about this and why it, I think, appropriately disturbs me is that when we began our church 26 years ago, actually it's 26 years ago this month, it was a startup and it was 100% shift. We just abandoned everything in the Southeast that churches normally did, and we just did a completely different thing that we were told wouldn't work. And we were extraordinarily successful, and we had extraordinary momentum, and it wasn't because we were brilliant, it's just because we were the only one. So here's a leadership tip that may be worth the price of the day. If you have the only hot dog stand in town, your hot dogs do not have to be that good. Let me say that again. This might be the most profound thing I say. If you have the only hot dog stand in town, your hot dogs don't have to be all that good. And so the innovative entrepreneur, the startup, generally speaking, it's the only hot dog stand in town. It doesn't even have to be that good. So having experienced that 26 years ago and watching other churches kind of slowly begin to make these shifts, and in my arrogance, as a 28-year-old leader thinking, what is wrong with these people? Why can't they just, shift and be nimble and catch up? Total arrogance. Because now, 26 years later, I'm part of this big, large, multi-campus, nonprofit organization, and I find myself worried that we will fall so in love with how we've done what we've done through the years. And now we teach what we've done through the years, and other people come to learn from us because of what we've done through the years. That we will fall into this same trap. That we will become more obsessed with how we do what we do, rather than why we do it and who we do it for. So in my final few minutes, I wrote in my notes, and you'll understand why I said this in just a minute. My goal is to remain appropriately paranoid. Appropriately paranoid. You can be so paranoid that people are afraid of you, or you can be so apathetic they wonder if you have a pulse. But in leadership, there's an appropriate amount of paranoia that no matter how successful you are, and no matter what you've accomplished, who's out there breaking the rules that's going to disrupt this industry? Who's out there working around the edges that's going to disrupt the kind of business that we're in? And again, creating a culture that can do what you've designed the organization to do, while at the same time your eyes wide open and your hands wide open to what the future holds. That is the balance, and that is the call for leaders, especially in this culture. So real quick, I want to give you the 3 questions. Again, 2 of these sit on my credenza and have for years. These are the questions that keep me appropriately paranoid and appropriately stirred up to where I don't become complacent because of success, or because I'm just tired, or because, hey, I don't really have to deal with these things if I don't want to, that keep me moving forward and help me listen to the leaders around me. Number 1, the first question is this. I'll give them to you quick. What would my replacement do? What would my replacement do? I adapted this question from Andy Grove's book. He passed away in 2016. He was the 3rd employee. This is amazing. He was the 3rd employee of Intel, Andy Groves was, and he was the 3rd CEO of Intel. In his book, Only the Paranoid Survive, that's why I love that word, Only the Paranoid Survive. The title of the book is as good as the book. He tells this story, and it's where I got this question. In the 80s, Intel was making computer chips. That's what they were known for. And he loved making computer chips, he says in his book. He said the problem was the Japanese were making them cheaper. So he decided we'll make them faster. And then the Japanese made them cheaper and faster. And then he decided we'll make them even faster. He said, and we kept speeding up, and then the Japanese would catch up, and we'd speed up, they'd catch up. But anytime they came to market with new chips, the Japanese, they just undercut the market. They just made them cheaper and sold them cheaper. So this was driving him crazy. And he was trying to figure out, what do we do? And in the book, he tells this story, and I'm just going to read it to you and show it to you because it leads up to the importance and kind of galvanizes or underscores the importance of this question. They'd spent so much money trying to stay ahead and, make Intel the preeminent chip maker, not only just the preeminent chip. He said, I looked out the window at the Ferris wheel. I looked out the window of the Ferris wheel of the Great American Amusement Park outside their offices, revolving in the distance. And I turned back to Gordon. Now, Gordon Moore was the CEO at the time, and Andy Groves was his boss. He said, I turned back to Gordon and I asked, here's this great question. If we got kicked out, and the board brought in a new CEO, what do you think he would do? Now, if you like to scare yourself to death as a manager, no matter where you are in the organization, If you sit back in today and you thought, this is going to bother you all day, I hope so. It's a wonderful, terrible question. If I got fired and the board brought in, or my boss brought in, a new person to take your job or a new person to sit in your seat, what do you think he would do? That question oftentimes brings such extraordinary clarity that it will give you the energy and the courage to embrace the shift. Gordon answered without hesitation, Andy says in the book. He would get us out of memories, or he would get us out of the chip business. And he says, I stared at him numb. And then I said, here it is. This is the gold. Why shouldn't you and I walk out the door, come back in, and do it ourselves? So here's the question for you today. If during this day, or even during this talk, or during the next few weeks, it dawns on you, if I lost my job, I know what the next person would do. I want to challenge you to walk out the door, come back in, and just do it yourself. Because you know. But you know too much. It's the curse of knowledge. You know all those people. You know the way it's always been done. You know what you're famous for. You know what the organization's famous for. You know what the bread and butter is. But if in the back of your mind you have the intuition of a leader, you kind of know. Then you walk out the door, you come back in. That quote sits on my credenza because it challenges me constantly. Andy, don't be a coward. Don't get lazy. Don't get used to the success. If there's some better way to do it, and if the next person walks in, the next person would walk in, they don't have relationships with all these wonderful people you love, and they would make the change, walk out the door, come back in, do it yourself. The way I say it to leaders all the time is marry your mission, date your model. Marry your mission, date your model. If you marry your model, the time is ticking backwards on your industry or your business. You marry the mission. Why are we doing this? Who are we doing it for? Why are we doing this? Who are we doing it for? The how is simply the model. And when we fall in love with our models and our way of doing things, we will miss the shift, we will resist the shift, and the people that are more inclined to embrace the shift will eventually leave us as well. So that's the first question. What would my replacement do? Number two, who am I listening to? In other words, who has access? Who is the most persuasive person or the most persuasive people around you? And are they the right people? And here's a warning, okay? If the people who are closest to you that you listen to the most, if their financial security, if their tenure, if their reputation is tied to the status quo, they will empower you to resist change and resist the shift because they have too much at stake. One of our core leadership practices in our organization that's been this way for years, we've written about it, is listen to outsiders, listen to outsiders, listen to outsiders. People outside our industry, outside of our organization, new people, younger people. Al Reese in his book Focus made this statement. This is another statement that actually hangs in another part of my office. He says, the next generation product almost never comes from the previous generation. The next generation product almost never comes from the previous generation, which means people in some of our seasons of life, we need to shut up and listen. Because once upon a time, I had all the new cool ideas. I have not had a new cool idea in 20 years. In fact, the best thing for me to do is sit in meetings and keep my mouth shut and listen to the people who are smarter than me and younger than me, and to figure out how to fuel their initiatives. Because I just haven't had a great idea lately. And I'll tell you a secret, and don't let this leave the room, please. Okay, those of you in remote sites, this is a deep, dark secret. If you'll keep your mouth shut and you'll fuel the next generation products that the next generation people in your organization come up with, people will think it's you. It's wonderful. Okay, I didn't say that. Anyway, no, so I'm constantly telling them, wasn't my idea. Wasn't my idea, that was so great. Wasn't my idea. Andy, I can't believe y'all are doing that. Hey, I think it's great too, I gotta tell you. Wasn't my idea, I haven't had a great idea in a while. Because the next generation product rarely comes from the previous generation. And at my age, in my season of life, I'm the previous generation. I may be the reason our organization that I started and I love so much refuses the shift if I don't listen to the right people. The next thing, too, as far as listening, is you got to listen to the people closest to the critical event. I wish I had a lot of time to talk about this. By critical event, I mean this. In your industry or your business, there's a critical event. There may be two or three, but there's surely one, but there may be two or three. The critical event is the event in your industry or your organization that if it doesn't go well, it doesn't matter what else goes well. Do you know what it is? As soon as I said that, it's like, oh yeah, it's right there at checkout. Oh, it's right there in those calls with the consultants. It's right there in that first encounter. It's right there when there's a critical event, and if the critical events are the things in your business or organization, if those don't go right, it doesn't matter how well the rest of it goes. For us, it's Sunday morning. If Sunday morning is great with children and adults, we're good to go Monday through Friday. If the gatherings on Sunday don't go well, it doesn't matter Monday through Friday. So your organization has a critical event. You need to make sure you are listening to the people closest to the critical event. And the curse of organizational life is this: moving up generally moves you away. Moving up generally moves you away from the critical event. You make more money, you're surrounded by, different kinds of people. You got a corner office. You have no idea what's going on, right? I learned this, or I got a great example of this from my friend Frank Blake. Frank came in 2007 and rescued Home Depot, who's based right there in Atlanta. And he said when he got there, he realized, he's in corporate office on the 7th or 8th or 9th floor, whatever it was, and he's like, okay, what happens in this office is irrelevant to the success of Home Depot. He realized the critical event happens where you and I show up at a Home Depot. The critical event happens walking the floor, and the critical event happens when people are checking out. So he said, I realized I had to figure out as the CEO, how do I get closer to that critical event, and how do I help influence that critical event? And so he did. And I thought that's the beauty of leadership, and that's the power of a good leader. It's like, even though moving up moves me away, I'm gonna figure out a way to get closer, and we have to figure out how to listen to the people who are closest to the critical event. So the question is, who do you listen to? Who do you listen to? Do you listen? Closed-minded leaders, closed minds. And if you close minds, your innovators will leave. The people who love to shift will leave. And do you know who we'll be left with? The people who love the status quo. And they'll never do anything wrong, and they'll never do anything great. And you'll wonder what happened, and you won't shift. So number one, what will my replacement do? Number two, who am I listening to? And number three, I pulled this right out of the Paradigms book, or Future Edge. Some of you read that way back by Joel Barker. Here's the question: what do I believe is impossible to do in my field, but if it could be done, it would fundamentally change my business? This is another one of those questions that sits on my credenza. It drives me crazy. It keeps me thinking forward. What do I believe is impossible? Well, that can't even be done. Well, that's it. Well, no, yeah, if somebody figured that out, that would change everything. That's it. Oh yeah, well, if somebody figured out how we could do that and didn't have to do it and didn't cost so much, that would change everything. That's it. As a leader, you need to have an answer to this question. Not the solution to the problem, but you need to have an answer to this question, because this question has the power to keep you looking forward, keep your hands wide open, and get the people around you to keep their hands wide open and their minds wide open as well. We all need to have an answer to that question. It's a reminder that a shift may be on the horizon, and here's the thing: you may actually solve it if you decide you even knew what it is. But for sure, you will be quicker to recognize it when somebody else comes along and solves it. An illustration: Pandora solved it. Spotify picked up the ball and ran with it. Pandora solved the problem. Spotify exploited it. So if you know what the problem is, if anybody solved it, would change your industry. If you're asking that question, you may not be the one, your organization may not be the one that solves it, but you will be open to the fact that when somebody begins breaking the rules, working around the edges, you'll be open to embracing the shift instead of folding your arms and go, well, that'll never work. Those kinds of things never actually pan out. In the book, he says this as well, and I'll close. Those who say it cannot be done should get out of the way of those who are doing it. Those who say, well, that can't be done, they should get out of the way of those who are actually doing it. So here's the three questions. What would my replacement do? Who am I listening to? What do I believe is impossible to do? Your responsibility as a leader is to create a culture that's not afraid of those questions, while at the same time you get your job done. You look at the margins, you look at the spreadsheets, you kind of do the daily stuff, the blocking and the tackling, all the while your eye is on the future. Because there are shifts that are coming. And the organizations that embrace those, they'll thrive. The organizations that miss those will perhaps die. And it has nothing to do with the industry. It has nothing to do with the organization. It has everything to do with leadership. And that's why you're here. And that's why today is so extraordinarily